So this is going to be a higher level talk. I'm not going to go into the specifics of how Polymer itself works. I think Eric and Matt have already done a really awesome job covering that. Instead, what I want to do is I want to cover some of the element sets that we're shipping today. I want to give you enough information so that all of you can get up and running. You can start playing with these things in your own projects. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rob Dodson. I'm a developer advocate here at Google. I work on the open web platform, but I primarily work on the Polymer project. And I am especially excited to be working on Polymer today because I really think it's going to fundamentally change the way that we build and design our web applications. Now, right now, we're in a very interesting moment in web development where we're moving from the desktop over to this new multi-device landscape. And with that comes a lot of challenges and expectations, where the things that we build are expected to be very app-like. But HTML itself doesn't always give us the best tools for completing that task. It wasn't designed to be app-like. It was designed for more of a document-centric model. So the HTML elements that you have to work with today are for things like creating headers, bulleted lists, paragraphs, things like that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to knock on HTML. I think it's awesome. I think it is the greatest publishing platform in the history of the human race, okay? So I think the web is amazing, but I just think it has a lot of potential. It's got a lot of room to grow into. And if we had the opportunity to redesign HTML today, knowing what we know about the whole multi-device landscape, I think it would probably look a bit more like this, right? We'd probably have some more elements like this that we could use for transitioning from one state to another, maybe having nice responsive drawers so we could slide on and off screen. And this is really what we're trying to accomplish with Polymer. We want to give developers the tools so that they can actually extend HTML, and that together we can build a new ecosystem of elements which are responsive by default, and performant by default, and accessible, and do all of these app-like things that we want. So that's what we're going to be touching on today. We're going to look at two element sets. We're going to start by looking at the core elements. These are released now. They are very general purpose, sort of utilitarian. They're not highly stylized. They're meant to be kind of like bedrock that you build upon. And we split these into two categories. We've got visual elements and non-visual elements. The visual elements are for things like creating toolbars, header panels, menus, and things like that. And the non-visual elements are for doing things like working with AJAX or local storage or even the file system. And I know it might seem weird to think about working with AJAX and the file system using an HTML element, but I promise you, when you start using these elements, when you start composing them together and binding things together, you're going to find that this is an amazing workflow that you really enjoy. So that's the core elements. We're also going to be touching on the paper elements, which I think you've probably heard a lot about at this point. The paper elements are going to be more stylized. They're part of that material design system, and they're really designed to push the envelope of what we've come to expect in the browser in terms of animation, and lighting, shadow, and spatial relationships. So these are the things we're going to touch on. These are the major categories that we're going to try and cover. We're not going to cover everything because there's just way too many elements to touch upon in one talk, but we are going to give you enough information so that you can get rolling and get up and running. And the first place I want to start is with layout. Now, this is where most of us begin our applications anyway. We're just trying to block some stuff out on the screen, figure out where it's going to live on the page. And a very common starting point is with navigation. And so to aid in this process, we've created an element called core toolbar, which is a very basic HTML element for holding controls such as buttons or tabs or title. I think this is a great place to start with web components if you're just getting up and running using Polymer, because it's a very simple element. All it does is it just lays out its children in space, right? It doesn't do anything too crazy. And as Matt spoke about before, if you want to get started using a custom element, all you've got to do is import it and then start working with the tag just like it's any other HTML element. So I'll run that by you again. If you want to use any Polymer element, any custom element, you first need to import its definition, and then you just start working with it, just like any other HTML tag. And what we've done here is we've actually thrown a div inside of our toolbar to give us a little title up there. And because custom elements are all about composability, we can throw in additional assets. We can throw in an icon button, which will give us a little hamburger menu that we can play with. We can also style this thing. We can throw a tall class on it, and the toolbar knows that it should expand once that class is on there, and we can do something like include an image background at this point. Now, what's really awesome is that to get all of this that you're seeing on screen right now, I haven't had to go in and write a bunch of CSS, right? It's just baked into the element. And as I'm just composing these things together, it lays out properly. Now, a very common pattern is to take a core toolbar and nest it inside of another element called a core header panel. And core header panel is a really simple container which just has a toolbar area up at the top and then a main content section down below. And the core header panel's sole job is to manage the scrolling of the page. So as you see here, when the user starts interacting with our device, it's going to keep our core toolbar pinned to the top of the document and allow the content to scroll underneath it. So that's the default mode for core header panel. Now, because custom elements are configurable, we can change that mode. We can set it to scroll. And what that's going to do is it's going to take our toolbar and it's going to fuse it with the rest of the content on the page. So as you see, when the user is scrolling now, it's actually going to slide the toolbar off the screen. And it's going to move with the rest of the content. And if we want to kind of riff on that taller toolbar that we had before, we have another mode, which is waterfall tall, which will actually do this cool sort of condensing animation as it collapses the toolbar down and the user scrolls around on screen. Now again, I'm not writing a bunch of CSS to get these effects. I'm not writing a bunch of JavaScript to make all these things happen. I'm getting these effects by composing these elements together. They're smarter, more powerful HTML elements that know how to work together. Now, an interesting variation of the core header panel is another element called a core scroll header panel. And it basically has all the same capabilities as the header panel, but it adds this really neat condenses attribute. And what that's going to do is as the user is scrolling, it's actually going to do this crossfade effect between our background image and our toolbar. And as they start to come back up the page, it'll slide the toolbar back in until they reach the top where it'll do a crossfade again. Again, this is a really sophisticated effect, right? This is the kind of app-like behavior that I want to have, but I'm not having to write a mountain of CSS and JavaScript to get to this point. I'm just composing these elements together. All right, so we talked a bit about sort of general layout. Because the multi-device web is sort of the major theme of this event, we've got to talk about responsive layout. And we've created some elements to help out with this as well. So we've got a core drawer panel, which is a responsive container, which will lay out its children in a sidebar, either on the left or the right, and in a main content area. So if I have a child of the core drawer panel, and I give it this drawer attribute, the content that I place inside of that drawer is going to show up in my sidebar. And if I place content in an element with a main attribute, then all that content is going to display in my main content area. Now, what's really cool about the core drawer panel is that it knows on a smaller screen that it needs to collapse down and move that sidebar out of the way. So we're only going to focus on the main content area when we're on a smaller device. But it's very easy to rig it up so that it slides that drawer back out, and the user can then start interacting with those additional controls. Now, what I've shown up to this point has been very general layout elements, right? They're sort of one size fits all. But there are going to come times when you need more granular control over the layout in your application. And so to help out with that, we've created what we call layout attributes, which basically add declarative support for CSS Flexbox to your application. And the way we do this is, under the hood, when you import Polymer, we also include an additional style sheet that has these Flexbox CSS selectors kind of ready to go. And that means that you can use these attributes inside of a Polymer element definition or just outside, anywhere in your page. Any page that's using Polymer, you can use these layout attributes. Let me show you some examples of that. So what I've got here is just some divs, right? I'm not inside of a Polymer element definition. I'm not doing anything crazy. I've just got a collection of divs. And on that parent div, I've told it that I'd like it to lay out its children horizontally using Flexbox. If I want, I can specify that any of those children should flex to try and take up as much space as it can. And this also works in the vertical orientation. I can just change that direction attribute from horizontal to vertical, and now everything's laying out top to bottom. And again, flexing works in this orientation as well. We've also added support for flex ratios. So if you want to specify that a child should be 3 times the size of one of its siblings, you can do that as well. And because we're working in Flexbox, we've always got 2 axes that we've got to kind of keep in mind. We've got our main axes, which flows in the direction of our primary layout. Since we are doing layout horizontal, that main axis flows left to right. So if I want to center justify something in that main axis, I can pass in a center justified attribute, or start justified to have it at the beginning, or end justified to have it at the end. I've also got a cross axis, which is always going to be flowing perpendicular to my main axes. And if I'd like to center a child in the cross axes, I just pass a center attribute. Now, if I combine these attributes, center justified and center, I get sort of like the holy grail of layout, which is vertical and horizontal centering. And I don't have to write any CSS to do this, okay? I just get that from using attributes, which is awesome. Yeah! Yeah. Okay, in my opinion, this is like one of the coolest things in the world. It just happens to be part of Polymer, but I don't want to go back to like doing web design without these attributes because they make my life so much easier. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy that. Okay, we talked a lot about layout. Let's move on. Let's talk about the material design stuff because it's pretty exciting. It's a big part of the keynote. What we've been doing is we've been creating material elements which are really aimed at pushing the boundaries of what we expect in terms of animation, lighting, and spatial relationships in the browser. And so that means taking things that we kind of take for granted on the web, like your typical checkbox, and reimagining it for 2014. So this is a paper checkbox element. And as you see here, it's got some really standout features. It's got these really fluid animations, and it's also got these cool reactive ink effects anytime a user clicks on something with their mouse or taps on it on a touch device. So it's really good because the user on a touch device is going to get some really specific feedback about what they've just interacted with. And these elements are meant to be drop-in replacements for a lot of the tags that we use every day. So this is another example. This is paper toggle button. And as you can see, it's about as straightforward to use as anything you could imagine. It's just simple HTML, and that's by design. We want it to be really easy for you guys to bring these things into your projects and just start working with them. Now, text input, probably one of the most commonly used controls on the web, and it's gotten a lot of attention in the material design system. So this is a paper input element, and as you see here, there's a lot of really interesting effects going on as we're interacting with it. We've got a floating label attribute here, and what that does is it actually jumps our label up above the text input area as the user is typing, which is really good on a space-constrained device like a mobile phone where you don't always have a great place to put the label, but you do want the user to still know what they're working with. And we've also got some other interesting attributes here. We've got a validate attribute, so we can validate what the user is typing using regular expression. And we get this error state basically for free. That red bar and the icon, that's all built into the element. And we can just configure what the error message is by passing in an error attribute. One more element I want to touch upon real quick. This is paper tabs. If you've ever built tabs before, just in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you know that it's oftentimes just like div soup, right? Like you write a bunch of markup, you shellac it with CSS until it looks right, and then you hit it with some JavaScript so it'll do the sort of like toggle state that you want. And what I love about paper tabs is just that it's just using so much less markup and less CSS, and overall it's just less clutter in my document. And when I have an idea that I'm trying to get out of my head onto the page, I don't want to have to invent everything from scratch. I want HTML to be expressive for me. I want to be able to use these new tags and just say, I want some tabs, and I get it. Now, one thing that you notice about probably a lot of these elements is this cool sort of reactive ink effect as the user is tapping on the screen. Now, we wanted other developers to be able to use the cool effects that are in the material design system in their own elements. And so what we've done is we've actually broken those effects out into standalone elements that anyone can drop into an element that they're working on. So this is a paper ripple element. This is how we actually generate that cool reactive ink effect that you see in all of the paper elements. And all I've done here is I've nested it inside of a div tag with an image. And then I've told the paper element that I want it to fit, so it's going to try and cover the surface area of that div tag when the user taps on it. And what's great about this is that it's a very, very small bit of effort to add a bit more visual punch to your UI. And especially if your user is on a touch device, they're going to get a lot more feedback about what it is that they're interacting with. Another example is paper shadow. So we wanted to give developers the ability to create realistic shadows in their applications. And what paper shadow does is it allows you to set a visual z-depth on your element. So as you see here, as we're interacting with this thing, it's going to kind of jump off of the page, which is nice because as your user is working with this element, it can start to feel a bit more alive and a bit more tactile, right? It can feel like they're actually interacting with a real thing. Now, under the hood, paper shadow is actually generating 2 shadows, so it looks a bit more realistic and lifelike, and it's an improvement on kind of the basic CSS box shadow. OK, so I don't have time to touch on all of the elements, because there's a whole lot more, and they're all really amazing and fun to play around with. What I will suggest is that you head over to the Polymer project website. We've actually just thrown up a sampler of all of our paper elements, so you can get to it from the homepage, play around with all these things, see some examples of them, grab some code, and start dropping them into your own application. I want to move on from paper for a second, and I want to talk about theming, because it's a topic that comes up a lot. How do you take these elements, now that you've got them and now that you're excited to use them, how do you take them, bring them into your own application, and make them feel like they belong, to your project? And so we've got a few new tools in the toolbox to do theming. The first is the new shadow pseudo element. And this is part of CSS Shadow DOM. And the new shadow pseudo element is going to allow you to pierce an element shadow boundary and style its immediate children. And so as you see in this example, I've got a paper slider element. And it's got this really dark blue knob that the user is currently dragging across the screen. So if I want to change the color of that knob, I can use the shadow pseudo element, I can pierce the paper slider, and I can specifically target that one child element inside of there and change its color. Now this is good if you know specifically what you want to target, or you just want to tweak a few things. Shadow is really great for that. But if you want to do something that's a bit more far-reaching, we also have the new deep combinator, which will pierce all shadow boundaries and allow you to style any child in the shadow DOM. And a really common theme is to do something like put a class on your body, something like red theme, use a deep combinator, and then pierce all of your elements' shadow boundaries to update something inside of them. Now, I know that all of these elements that I'm showing here are paper elements. I know that they all have paper ripples inside of them, and I want to change the ink color to red. So what I'm doing here is I'm just applying that red theme to my body, using deep to dive into all those elements and update their ink in one fell swoop. Now, just using shadow and deep, you can get pretty far with theming your site. This is an example that Eric Beidelman put together. This is from his material playground. And what you're seeing here is he's got a whole bunch of paper elements on screen. He's interacting with them. And then he's going to hit this switch and change all of their colors over to green from purple. And you can do this with typography. You can do this with padding and spacing and things like that. So with just those 2 tools, you can get pretty far. But developers often see this and they start to freak out a little bit. And they're like, hey, you're breaking the style encapsulation. I thought the whole idea of Shadow DOM was that we weren't going to do that. And I want to make a point here. So the shadow boundary is intended to prevent accidental styling in the shadow DOM. We don't want a developer to accidentally turn everything red. That is bad, right? But we do want to give developers the final say over what their site looks like. And that means giving them the tools and the flexibility to reach inside of something and specifically say, no, that thing should look this way because it's my site, and I say so. So that's the intention there, but we get it, right? Preserving style encapsulation is a good thing to do. And so we've been experimenting with an element called core style, which allows you to share styles between elements, but also preserve encapsulation at the same time. And I'm going to put this experimental badge on this because it's definitely still kind of in that developer preview, we're working on it phase, but it's also so interesting that I wanted to talk about it today so you guys could get up and running and start playing with it. The way core style works is you have a core style element, which is going to act as your style producer. And inside of this element, you can put in CSS that you intend to end up inside of someone else's shadow DOM. Then inside of your Polymer element definition, I've got an xfoo tag that I'm creating here. I've got another core style element there with a reference attribute. I'm actually targeting the core style element that's above it, that tomato theme core style producer. So we create this little relationship between producer and consumer. You can have, multiple consumers all pointed at the same producer. You can have multiple producers and a consumer changing which one it's looking at, right? You can mix and match this any way you want. But the overall effect is that we end up with a themed element, and we didn't have to specifically go in and target that item. Now, another really cool, interesting feature of core style is style bindings. So maybe you're working on a theme, and maybe you don't know exactly what color you want to use for a particular aspect, but you do want to expose a hook to the user so that they can set that value later. So using a style binding, here we're just using mustache syntax. We've got my color set up as a binding. And then later on in the script, in their document, the user can set the value for my color. And they can do it on a per instance basis, or they can do it globally, which is what we're doing here, using the core style.g object. And again, this gives us the effect of a styled element, and we didn't have to specifically go in and target anything using shadow or deep. So there's a lot of good stuff here in the world of theming. It's all still sort of exploratory, but I'm excited by where this is heading. I think we're definitely getting there. The last thing I want to touch on are transitions. How do I move from one state of my application to the next? And we've been doing some work here as well. This is an element called core animated pages, which is also still kind of in that developer preview phase. We're still kind of working on it, but it's so cool I wanted to show it today. And core animated pages, as it says, is a pluggable system for creating transitions from one state of your app to the next. So I've got a core animated pages element here. Inside, I've got some sections. That's what you're seeing on the phone there. I've got a selected index, and then I've got a list of the transitions that are going to play as that index is updated. So as the user is interacting with these tabs, all I'm doing is updating the index, and it's sliding over the different sections using the transition that was provided. Now, because this is a pluggable system, it means you can do some pretty wild things with it. And if any of you have seen Topeka, which is our sort of flagship app kind of demonstrating a lot of the core and paper elements, you've probably seen a lot of these really awesome hero transitions that happen as you answer different quiz questions. And what's going on here is all of these are animations that were created using core animated pages. So there's a lot that you can do here. But instead of just talking about this, I can actually show you a brief demo using our designer tool. Now, some of you may have seen our designer tool before. It's kind of like a drag and drop editor for working with web components. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to build a little piece of Topeka using this tool. And so we're going to start by grabbing a card out of this palette here. And what we're doing right now is we're just dropping Polymer elements into a canvas. So I'm going to drop a card on screen. And we're going to grab some paper elements as well. So we'll grab paper input, throw that in there. Grab another paper input. And as you can see, right now, it's kind of laying out, but it's not exactly what I want, right? I'd like it to have a little bit more padding. So I can go over to my properties inspector here. For my card, I can switch to the styles, and I can go down to padding and just add a tiny bit of padding. And now it looks a little bit nicer. And right now, these labels are kind of nondescript. They just say type something. So I can go to my properties inspector, and I could update them here. But I can also hop into the code. If I want, I can just change the label value here from type something to first name and last name. And then save that and switch back, and now my labels have updated. And if we want to go as far as adding validation, we can do that as well. So we can say that we only want to accept letters and not numbers. So I'll say, yeah, only give me capital and lowercase letters, and no numbers, please. So as the user is typing, they can type in some letters, that works, but as soon as they start typing in numbers, it's going to start yelling at them. And if I want, I can throw an error message in there as well. I can be like, yo, only letters, dude. And then I can give them a little frowny face so they know I mean business here. All right. All right. So let's add some more stuff here. Let's throw in some icons so the user can pick their avatar. Drop those in there. Let's also throw in an action button. So when the user is done, they can navigate out of this screen. And this action button right now, it's kind of laid out far left. I'd like it to lay out to the far right. And I can use some of those layout attributes to do that. So I can tell it to justify to the end and just slide it over. Now, really quickly, I've created my sign-in form. And it didn't take a lot of effort. And the code underneath is pretty straightforward as well. But I said I was going to show off core animated pages. So let's actually grab a little scaffold. Just drop this on the screen. You guys see that OK? I need to zoom out a little. And over in core animated pages, drop this element in there. So we just dropped a core animated pages element into our scaffold. And the last thing we're going to do is just drop our card on top of it. And now this is starting to kind of look like a mobile application. And what I want to do next is I want to bind the core animated pages selected index to these tabs. So as I click on the different tabs, it changes which page is showing. So over in my tree view, I'm going to select core animated pages, go to its properties, and we're going to hook up a data binding. And we're going to bind to the selected property of our paper tabs. So now as we click from item 1 to item 2, it's going to attempt to show 2 pages. But we don't have a second page at the moment. We can change that. We can kind of cheat, and we can do like a cooking show. Pull out the turkey, fully baked. Oh, man, look at that. And now that I've got these 2 pages, I want to animate between them. I want to fire up core animated pages. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell each element which animation it should use as we transition. So for all of these tiles here, I'm going to tell them to do a tile cascade. And I'm also going to tell them to fade out. For our header here, I'm going to tell it to slide down. And then we switch over here. For our card, I'm going to tell it to slide up. And the last thing we need to do is we need to tell core animated pages all of the animation targets that we just created. So we got slide up, slide down, fade, and tile cascade. And now, if the demo gods are smiling, when we click on item 2, whoa, we get some nice transitions. Yay. So that's pretty exciting. Oh, where's my clicker? Here we go. So that's really awesome. If you want to play around with Designer more, it is up on the Polymer project website, but it's also up on GitHub. So that means you can take it, you can fork it, you can play around with it. And what's really cool is that it means anyone can take this and add their own components to it, right? And that's exactly what the team at Salesforce has done. So a group led by Eugene Oxman and Akhilesh Gupta from the Salesforce Mobile SDK team has actually taken Designer, they've extended it, they've created Salesforce elements using Polymer. These are UI and data elements. And they've added them to the Designer. So what you're seeing here is Akhilesh is actually building a Salesforce mobile app using these components. And what's really awesome is that these Salesforce components are already set up to connect to the Salesforce backend. So for things like identity and APIs and offline sync and storage, like all that stuff, it's already built into their elements, which is really super cool. And so by combining Salesforce API and Polymer, their developers get the best of both worlds. And I think what you're going to see here is, in a second, Akhilesh is going to grab the code, and I think he throws it into Cordova, and he's going to preview it in the iOS simulator and also the Android device simulator. How cool is that? OK. Yeah. All right, so what did we learn today? Hopefully a lot. Hopefully you guys are leaving here really excited, because we covered a lot of ground. These are the major categories that we started off with. And to summarize, if you want to scaffold your app together, you want some good bedrock to build upon, you can use these core elements that are out there today. We've also shipped the paper elements, which are part of the material design system. So if you want to create some really beautiful interactive UIs, we've got that as well. We've got new tools like Shadow and Deep and Core Style for theming. And there's a lot of good exploration that's happening in that space. And lastly, if you want to move between different states in your application, you want to generate some really amazing eye-catching transitions, you can use Core Animated Pages. Now, if you don't take anything else from this talk, the one thing that I ask of all of you is to head over to the Polymer project website, download Polymer, and give it a shot. We've just completely revamped the website. We've got all new getting started guides. We've got the paper sandbox up there. We've got element catalog. We've got designer. A bunch of new documentation for things like icons and gestures. There's tons of stuff to cover there. So please hit up the Polymer website and check it out. Also, check out the Google Developers channel on YouTube. We've recorded a whole bunch of dev bites on Polymer, building elements, building accessible elements, connecting with Google services through web components. Lots of really awesome stuff. I'm personally just super excited by where all of this is heading. I hope you are as well. I really do believe that together we can build a new ecosystem of amazing HTML elements, and we can revolutionize the mobile web. So thank you all so much for coming, and enjoy I/O. And we have time for questions, but there's microphones up here. Please come up to the microphones to ask questions, because otherwise the video won't pick you up.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for all the awesome work on Polymer. I noticed that you're using attributes for the things that classes have been traditionally used for, and I was wondering if you could speak to the motivation behind that.
I'm trying to think of I think that configuring things through attributes, it feels like how you work with other HTML elements typically. And that is probably why we are heading in that direction. You can still use classes if you like, if you kind of prefer to do things that way. But with Polymer itself, there's a lot of built-in niceties to using attributes. So you're going to get, if you change an attribute in Polymer, you've got automatic change handlers, which are going to detect when that thing has been changed. So really, the framework itself is adding some more sugaring to that particular area. So that's why we're supporting that.
And did the order of the attributes matter? Like when you say float left or layout horizontal or something like that, do they talk to each other, or how does that work?
That layout should not matter. Or the order of the attributes, sorry, should not matter.
OK.
Yeah.
Thanks.
How does, so using JavaScript from the global of the app, like say a jQuery or something like that, to interact with these, does that change, or is that sort of the same as it always was?
Interacting with them from the outside is totally the same, because to jQuery or a framework, it just looks like an HTML element on the outside, right, when you create a custom element. When you're on the inside of an element, if you're trying to use jQuery inside of your element definition, you got to be careful there, because jQuery doesn't necessarily know about the shadow DOM, so you can run into weird situations. So we typically just use vanilla JavaScript, and to be honest, with query selector and for each and a handful of other things, that gets you 90% of what you need usually. So, yeah.
Is that JavaScript sandboxed inside the shadow DOM, or is it?
No, JavaScript is part of the page. Yeah.
So my question is kind of similar to his. I've been using Angular for the last year or so, and I was just wondering how well it plays with Angular.
Yeah. So the one, I guess, big distinction to make is to also keep in mind that Polymer is kind of meant to be like a new thing. It's built on top of web components. It's kind of trying to head in that direction. But if you are trying to mix the two together, like anecdotally, I've dropped like paper elements even into an Angular project and had Angular kind of like poking them and driving them and everything. And it generally seems to work out okay. There may be some issues around like data binding complex data objects. I'm not sure. Like I don't know for certain. But in general, a framework that knows how to work with HTML can work okay with Polymer elements because it is just HTML. Thank you.
So thanks, great presentation. What about accessibility? So for instance, the checkboxes I saw was using canvas elements, and like I tried to navigate with my tab around like in the browser, but I wasn't really able to do that. So yeah, is there any thought into that? Is that going to be, is that on the roadmap or?
Yes, absolutely. So accessibility is a big concern for us. We want to make accessibility easier on the web. We want to give developers better primitives so that it's not such a chore to add accessibility to your project. So we've been working with Alice Boxhall, and I believe she's actually going to be doing a sandbox session if she hasn't already, but it might be tomorrow, on building accessible web components. And she also has a dev bite that she has recorded, which is up already on YouTube, which explains, goes into great detail how to do accessible web components. So yes, it's definitely on the roadmap. We are totally going to do it and support it. For I/O, it's a bit of a crunch there last minute, but it's coming for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Hello again. Hello again. One of the cool visions behind web components is the idea that everything is composable and that you like expose a public API and then you have this private API to do whatever you like with. And then when I see the angry developers bit that you posted earlier about how you can pierce the shadow DOM, I wonder what the story is as far as maintaining that separation of I'm the guy who makes the component and I'm the guy who consumes it, and it doesn't really matter what the guy who makes it does without breaking the other person's site. If there's a story, it's like how versioning works, or if there are best practices as to when you pierce a shadow DOM, or how you expose things should be pierced versus not pierced.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we've actually like done a ton to codify when you should and shouldn't pierce things. I think in general, if you give something like an ID or a class, that's kind of been one of the ways that we've been thinking about saying, if I specifically name something, if I give it like a name that's sort of intended for the world and I document that, and I say in my documentation, okay, that knob is called slider knob and I'm telling you its name, and if you need to get in, that's how you do it. It's kind of a bit of like an agreement between the person creating the thing and the person using it, that they're going to document the bits that they are cool with people changing, right? And as for versioning stuff, I mean, we've been just following semantic versioning rules, so you just need to keep an eye on things. And I saw someone mention the other day on Twitter, they were like, well, what if I want to just like add a border and like some additional UI to an element? Isn't that going to break everybody? And if you think it's going to break everybody, then that needs to be a major version update in your semantic versioning, right? Because if it's going to break somebody, then it's not backwards compatible. It is API breaking, so that needs to be a major version uptick. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
You showed a video with demonstrating someone using Cordova. How well does Polymer perform in legacy WebView on Android?
Like Android browser?
Like, if I have an app with a WebView and I'm showing a Polymer display.
So right now, my understanding is that the WebView in KitKat is the one that is going to work with Polymer. Older web views, basically stuff that's not based on Chromium, is not going to work. So, yeah.
Yeah, quick question. CSS is so much simpler and cleaner, but how does it work on something other than Chrome, such as some of those other evil browsers like IE?
They're our friends. It works good on the other browsers.
Okay.
So we test on all the other browsers. We make sure that we're doing our best to work in Firefox, Safari, IE. Our support, that was not, sorry, I'm just nervous. That was not meant to be a slight. We support the last 2 versions of every browser. That's kind of our target. So, yeah.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, that's it. Thank you all so much. Enjoy. Oh, sorry, one more. Sorry.
Fan of Bootstrap.
Yes.
So how does this compare to replacing the Bootstrap?
Yeah. So the thing about Bootstrap is awesome, right? And the reason why it's awesome and so successful is because it gave us guidance. And we were like, I get components, I can use them, these are awesome. But there's just a lot of markup that goes into Bootstrap, right? Like their nav bar is like, wow, it's crazy. So my hope is that you can take Bootstrap and evolve it to this world, right? That in the future, Bootstrap is going to be a collection of custom elements. And that's what we've tried to do with the core elements and the paper elements, is to start heading in that direction. And when I'm talking about sort of like the ecosystem of shared elements, like that's really what I want, is that world where the thing about Bootstrap is you can't use Bootstrap with Foundation, right? Or another CSS framework. But with web components, you can. And that's huge. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping we head to.
All right, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
So at what point in the future do you expect that these will start to appear mainstream, that mainstream app will start using this? Is this 3 months out, or?
I mean,
can I use it now and sort of?
the time is
feel
now,
like it?
man. We're like talking about it in the keynote. Let's do this. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this is sort of, it's future facing, right? So you got to make sure that you're cool supporting the modern evergreen browsers. But if that's your major, user base, then do it. Go for it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys so much.